Story 1: The Blackstone Survey. My name is Nick, and I'm a geologist. I've spent 15 years studying rock formations, mineral deposits, and underground structures. I've been in hundreds of mines, caves, and quarries. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. It started with a routine assignment. Henderson Mining Corporation wanted me to survey the abandoned Blackstone Mine in the Appalachian Mountains. The mine had been closed for 30 years after a series of accidents, but recent market conditions made them reconsider. My job was simple: assess the structural integrity, evaluate remaining resources, and determine if reopening was feasible. The drive to Blackstone took me through increasingly remote mountain roads. By the time I reached the mine site, civilization felt like a distant memory. The entrance was sealed with rusted metal sheets, but the company had provided me with cutting tools and a temporary permit to enter. As I cut through the barriers, I felt the first chill, not from the mountain air, but something else, something that made my geological training seem suddenly inadequate. The mine's mouth yawned before me like a wound in the earth. My headlamp beam barely penetrated the darkness beyond. I checked my equipment one final time: gas detector, structural assessment tools, sample containers, emergency radio. Everything was in order. The first 100 meters were unremarkable. Standard timber supports, though aged and creaking. The air was stale but breathable. My gas detector remained silent. I documented everything methodically, just as I'd done countless times before. But then I noticed something odd. The rock formations didn't match the geological surveys on file. The strata were wrong. Layers that should have taken millions of years to form were compressed into spaces that defied explanation. It was as if the earth itself had been twisted, forced into impossible configurations. I told myself it was just poor record-keeping from the 1990s. Geological surveys from that era were often incomplete, but the deeper I went, the more disturbed I became. The patterns in the rock weren't natural. They resembled something organic, like the inside of a massive rib cage. At the 500-meter mark, I found the first chamber. It was enormous, far larger than any mining operation should have created. My headlamp beam couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by my own breathing and the distant drip of water. That's when I noticed the temperature anomaly. My instruments showed the air growing colder as I descended, which contradicted everything I knew about geothermal gradients. The deeper you go, the warmer it should get. But here, it was as if I were entering a vast refrigerator. I set up my equipment and began taking core samples. The drill bit met unexpected resistance. Not the resistance of hard rock, but something else. Something that felt almost alive. The samples that came up were unlike anything in my experience. Black, with a texture that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Hours passed. I should have been making steady progress, but something kept drawing my attention away from my work. Sounds that weren't quite sounds. Movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. The rational part of my mind attributed it to isolation and the disorienting effects of being underground. But then I found the shaft. It wasn't on any of the mine blueprints. A perfectly circular opening in the chamber floor, descending into absolute darkness. My headlamp beam seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. I dropped a rock into the opening and waited for the sound of impact. It never came. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I secured my climbing gear and began the descent. The shaft walls were smooth, almost polished, with no tool marks or blast patterns. It was as if the hole had been formed by something other than human hands. 20 meters down, I found the inscriptions. They weren't carved, they were burned into the rock. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, arranged in patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in my lamplight. They covered every surface of the shaft, becoming more complex and disturbing the deeper I went. My radio crackled to life, static at first, then what sounded like voices, but they weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. The sounds were harsh, guttural, and filled with an emotion I could only describe as hunger. I should have climbed back up immediately, but something about those inscriptions held me. They seemed to be telling a story, and despite my growing terror, I needed to understand what had happened here. At the bottom of the shaft, I found the chamber. It was vast, far larger than the one above. But this space felt different, ancient, not carved by miners, but worn smooth by something else. The walls curved inward, forming a perfect sphere, and at the center, suspended by chains that disappeared into the darkness above, was a structure I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't made of stone or metal. It seemed to be constructed from shadow itself. Absorbing light and reflecting nothing, my instruments went haywire in its presence. The gas detector began shrieking warnings about atmospheric anomalies that shouldn't exist. That's when I heard the breathing, not my own, something else, something massive, drawing slow, deliberate breaths in the darkness beyond my light. With each exhalation, the temperature dropped another degree. My breath began to fog, then to crystallize. I backed toward the shaft, but my climbing rope was gone, cut cleanly, the frayed end hanging just out of reach. I was trapped in that spherical chamber with something that was slowly awakening. The breathing grew louder, more purposeful, and then I saw it, not the creature itself, but its shadow. A silhouette that defied geometry with too many angles and appendages that moved independently. It was ancient beyond measure, and it was hungry. I ran, not towards the shaft, but deeper into the chamber, hoping to find another way out. My headlamp beam danced wildly as I stumbled through the darkness, illuminating glimpses of things that shouldn't exist, structures that hurt to perceive, made from materials that weren't quite matter. Behind me, the breathing became a roar, not angry, but pleased. It had been waiting so long for company. I found a crevice in the chamber wall and squeezed through, tearing my clothes and skin on the sharp rock. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for my body, but it led upward. I climbed desperately, my hands bleeding, my lungs burning. Hours later, I emerged into daylight, not from the mine entrance, but from a natural cave opening miles away. My equipment was gone, my samples lost, but I was alive. I submitted my report to Henderson Mining Corporation. Structurally unsound, I wrote, recommend permanent closure. They accepted my assessment without question, probably relieved to avoid the expense of reopening. But I know the real reason the mine should never be reopened. Some things are meant to stay buried, and some depths are too deep for human exploration. I've never returned to that mountain. I've never spoken about what I found in that spherical chamber, but sometimes in the deepest parts of other mines, I hear that breathing again. And I know that whatever sleeps beneath Blackstone is still there, waiting for the next curious soul to venture too far into the darkness. The earth has secrets. Some of them are geological, others are far more terrifying. Story 2: The Silent Mourner. My name is Tom, and I need to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made. It happened 3 years ago, but I still wake up screaming some nights. My friends think I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But what we saw in the Ashford Mine was real, and it's still there, waiting. It started as a dare. Me and my three best friends, Jake, Marcus, and Ryan, were looking for something to do on a boring Saturday night. We'd heard about the abandoned Ashford Mine from some older kids at school. They said it was haunted, but we didn't believe in ghosts. We were 18, invincible, and stupid. The mine was about an hour's drive from town, hidden in dense woods that seemed to swallow our headlights. We parked at the rusted gate and climbed over, carrying our flashlights and a couple of beers we'd stolen from Jake's dad. The entrance was a black hole in the hillside, partially collapsed but still accessible. "This is awesome," Marcus said, his voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. "It's like a real-life horror movie." We laughed and joked as we made our way deeper into the mine. The air was thick and stale, filled with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet and sickly that we couldn't identify. Our flashlight beams revealed old mining equipment, rusted rail tracks, and timber supports that groaned ominously overhead. About a quarter-mile in, we found the first chamber. It was larger than we'd expected, with several tunnels branching off in different directions. Jake pulled out his phone to take some selfies, but the screen kept flickering. The battery was full, but the phone kept glitching. "Must be the electromagnetic interference," Ryan said. He was the smart one, always had an explanation for everything. Old mines can mess with electronics. We chose the left tunnel and continued deeper. The walls here were different, smoother, as if they'd been carved by hand rather than blasted with dynamite. Strange symbols were scratched into the rock, crude but deliberate. They looked like they'd been made with fingernails rather than tools. That's when we heard it. A sound like cloth dragging across stone coming from somewhere ahead of us. We stopped, listening, but the sound faded into silence. "Probably just a rat," Jake said, but his voice was shaky. We pressed on, trying to maintain our bravado, but the atmosphere had changed. The playful energy we'd brought into the mine was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that made us speak in whispers and jump at every small sound. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller and more intimate, and that's where we saw her for the first time. She was standing in the far corner, her back to us, a woman in a white dress that seemed to glow faintly in our flashlight beams. Her hair was long and dark, hanging down her back like a curtain. She was perfectly still, as if she were a statue. "Hello?" Ryan called out, his voice cracking. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't move. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, waiting for her to acknowledge us. Then Jake took a step forward and she vanished. Not gradually, not like she walked away. She was there one moment and gone the next, as if she'd never existed at all. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered. We argued about what we'd seen. Jake insisted it was just shadows and our imaginations. Ryan thought maybe it was a homeless person who'd run away when they heard us coming. But I knew what I'd seen. There had been something wrong with the woman, something that made my skin crawl even before she disappeared. We should have left then. We should have turned around and walked back to the car. But teenage pride is a powerful thing, and none of us wanted to be the first to admit we were scared. We continued deeper into the mine, following a series of connecting tunnels that seemed to spiral downward. The air grew colder with each step, and our breath began to fog. The strange symbols on the walls became more frequent, more elaborate. Some of them looked like they'd been carved recently, the edges still sharp and clean. It was Marcus who noticed the footprints. Bare feet, small and delicate, pressed into the soft earth of the tunnel floor. They were heading in the same direction we were, a trail of silent steps leading deeper into the darkness. "These are fresh," he said, kneeling to examine them. "Someone was here recently." The footprints led us to a chamber that was different from the others. This one felt sacred, wrong. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, but these were different. They seemed to move in our flashlight beams, writhing and shifting like living things. And there, in the center of the chamber, was an altar, rough-hewn stone, stained with something dark that could have been rust or blood. Scattered around it were offerings, old coins, jewelry, photographs, and flowers. Dozens of wilted flowers, as if someone had been leaving them there for years. That's when she appeared again. This time, she was facing us, and we could see why she didn't speak. Her throat had been cut. The wound was deep and jagged, extending from ear to ear. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing teeth stained with blood. Her eyes were black holes, reflecting nothing, seeing everything. She raised one pale arm and pointed at us. Not at all of us, at me specifically. Her finger was accusatory, desperate. She was trying to tell us something, but no words came from her ruined throat. "We need to leave," I said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "We need to leave now." But my friends were transfixed. Jake was taking pictures with his phone, even though the screen was flickering wildly. Marcus was trying to get closer to the altar, fascinated by the strange symbols. Ryan was attempting to rationalize what we were seeing, muttering about optical illusions and gas leaks. The woman, the ghost, because that's what she was, began to move toward us. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She glided across the chamber floor, her white dress trailing behind her like mist. As she got closer, the temperature dropped even further. Our breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to form on the tunnel walls. She stopped directly in front of me. Up close, I could see that her dress was a wedding gown, though it was stained with dirt and blood. She'd been beautiful once, but death had carved away everything, except the sorrow in her empty eyes. She reached out and touched my face. Her fingers were ice cold, and where they made contact, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Not my loss, hers. The grief was so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I saw flashes of her life. A young woman in love. A wedding that never happened. A betrayal that led to murder. She'd been killed here, in this very chamber, left to die alone in the darkness while her killer escaped into the night. And she'd been waiting ever since, trapped by her own sorrow, unable to move on. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." Her expression changed. The accusation in her eyes softened into something like gratitude. She nodded once, then began to fade. Not vanish like before, but fade gradually, as if she were finally at peace. But as she disappeared, the chamber began to change. The symbols on the walls started to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. The altar cracked down the middle with a sound like breaking bones. And from somewhere deep in the mine, we heard a voice. Not the woman's voice, but something else. Something that had been feeding on her trapped spirit for decades. "Run," I shouted to my friends. "Run now." We ran, through the tunnels, following our own footprints back toward the entrance. Behind us, the voice grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't speaking English, but somehow I understood what it was saying. It was angry that we'd helped the woman find peace. It was hungry, and it wanted to replace her with something else. Jake stumbled and fell, his phone skittering across the tunnel floor. When he reached for it, something grabbed his ankle. Not a hand. Something with too many fingers and joints that bent the wrong way. He screamed and kicked, and whatever it was let go, but not before leaving deep scratches on his skin. We made it to the entrance just as the mine began to collapse behind us. Not a natural collapse, but something deliberate. The thing inside was sealing itself off, retreating deeper into the earth to wait for the next group of curious visitors. We drove back to town in silence. Jake's ankle was infected for weeks, and the scratches left permanent scars. Marcus started having nightmares and had to see a therapist. Ryan became obsessed with researching the mine's history, trying to find a rational explanation for what we'd experienced. I found the explanation in the town's historical records. In 1987, a young woman named Sarah Winters had gone missing 3 days before her wedding. Her body was found 6 months later in the Ashford Mine, but her killer was never caught. The mine was closed after several workers reported seeing her ghost in the tunnels. The workers described exactly what we'd seen: a woman in a white dress who couldn't speak, who wandered the tunnels looking for justice. Or maybe just looking for someone to acknowledge her suffering. I think about her sometimes. I hope she found peace after our encounter. I hope she was able to move on to whatever comes next. But I also know that something else remains in that mine, something that fed on her trapped spirit for 30 years, and now it's hungry again. Story 3: The Offering. My name is Danny, and I've been a miner for 23 years. I've worked copper, coal, and gold mines from Montana to Nevada. I've seen cave-ins, gas leaks, and underground fires. I thought I'd seen every danger the earth could throw at us. But what we found in the Copper Creek mine last month changed everything I thought I knew about what lies beneath our feet. I was part of a 5-man crew working the deep shafts at Copper Creek. It was a good gig, steady pay, decent safety record, and the foreman, Bill Santos, was one of the best I'd ever worked with. The other guys were solid too. Pete Martinez, who'd been mining longer than anyone, Tommy Chen, fresh out of school but eager to learn, and Big Jim Kowalski, who could move more rock in a day than most men could in a week. We were working the 800-foot level, following a promising copper vein that had been producing steadily for months. The company was happy, we were happy, and everything was going according to plan, until we broke through into the chamber. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Tommy was running the drill, working on a blast pattern Bill had laid out. The bit was cutting through the rock normally when suddenly it broke through with no resistance. The drill lurched forward, nearly throwing Tommy off balance. "That's weird," he said, shutting off the machine. "Feels like I hit a void." Bill came over to investigate. He shone his headlamp into the hole Tommy had drilled, and his face went pale. "Boys," he said quietly, "I think we found something." The hole opened into a space, not a natural cave, but something else. Something that had been sealed off deliberately. We could see worked stone beyond the opening, carved blocks fitted together with mathematical precision. It looked ancient, far older than any mining operation. "Could be an old tunnel," Pete suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Maybe from the 1800s, Bill shook his head. "This isn't 19th century work. This is something else entirely." We spent the rest of the day enlarging the opening, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever lay beyond. By evening, we had a hole large enough for a man to crawl through. Bill went first, then called back for the rest of us to follow. The chamber was magnificent and terrifying. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs, not Egyptian or Mayan, but something I'd never seen before. They seemed to tell a story, though none of us could read them. The images showed figures in robes performing rituals around a central altar and something being imprisoned or contained. At the center of the chamber stood a stone table, perfectly preserved. On it lay an object that made my skin crawl just looking at it. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a basketball, but it seemed to be made of some kind of crystalline material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Dark veins ran through it like blood vessels, and it pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. "We need to call the company," Bill said. "This is way beyond our pay grade." but Big Jim was already moving toward the table. "Look at this thing," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's beautiful and heavy. Feels like it's made of solid gold or platinum." "Don't touch it," Pete warned, but it was too late. Jim had already picked up the object, cradling it in his massive hands. The moment he touched it, the chamber changed. The hieroglyphs on the walls began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. And from somewhere deep in the stone, we heard a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Put it down," Bill ordered, but Jim seemed entranced. He was staring into the object's dark surface, and his eyes were reflecting the same eerie light as the walls. "It's showing me things," he whispered. "Beautiful things. Power, knowledge. Everything I've ever wanted." Tommy tried to grab the object away from Jim, but the big man pushed him back with inhuman strength. Jim's normally gentle demeanor was gone, replaced by something hungry and violent. "It's mine," he snarled. "It chose me. I can feel it calling to me." That's when we noticed the changes in the chamber. The carved figures on the walls were moving, their positions shifting subtly when we weren't looking directly at them. The altar in the center was no longer empty. Offerings had appeared on its surface. Fresh flowers, jewelry, and other items that hadn't been there moments before. "We're leaving," Bill said. "Now, all of us." But Jim refused to put down the object. He clutched it to his chest like a mother protecting her child, and the glow from the walls grew brighter. The sound of wind became a whisper, then voices, dozens of them, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. We tried to drag Jim out of the chamber, but he was impossibly strong. He threw Pete against the wall hard enough to crack his ribs, and when Tommy tried to help, Jim backhanded him across the face. The blow should have knocked Tommy unconscious, but instead, it left 5 deep scratches on his cheek, as if Jim's fingers had become claws. "It's been waiting," Jim said, his voice no longer entirely his own. "Waiting for someone worthy, someone strong enough to carry its gifts into the world." The object in his hands was changing too. The dark veins were spreading, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the pulsing was getting faster, more urgent, like a heart racing with excitement. That's when the mining equipment started failing. Our headlamps flickered and died, leaving us in the eerie glow of the chamber walls. The air circulation system shut down, and the temperature began to drop. But worst of all, we could hear something moving in the tunnels beyond the chamber, something large and patient drawing closer. "The seal is broken," Pete whispered, reading the hieroglyphs with sudden understanding. "That thing was a prison, and we just let it out." Jim laughed, but it wasn't his laugh. It was the sound of wind through empty spaces, of things long dead returning to life. The object in his hands was now completely black, absorbing all light, all hope, all warmth from the chamber. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't a prison. It's a key to doors that should never be opened." The whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now, promises of power, of knowledge, of immortality. But underneath the promises was something else, an overwhelming sense of hunger. Whatever the object contained, it had been starving for centuries, and now it was finally free to feed. Bill made a desperate decision. He pulled out his emergency charges, small explosives meant for clearing rockfalls, and began setting them around the chamber entrance. "If we can't stop it," he said, "maybe we can bury it again." But Jim saw what he was doing. With inhuman speed, he moved to block the entrance, still clutching the object. His eyes were completely black now, reflecting nothing, like looking into empty space. "You can't stop what's already begun," he said. The offerings have been made. The seal is broken. The door is open. That's when I saw them. The previous offerings on the altar weren't random items. They were personal belongings. A wedding ring, a pocket watch, a child's toy, and they were recent, maybe days old. Someone else had been here before us, someone who had fed their possessions to whatever lived in that object. The night shift, Pete breathed. The 3 guys who went missing last week, they found this place first. The implications hit us like a physical blow. The missing miners hadn't been caught in a cave-in or overcome by gas. They'd been taken by whatever was in that chamber, consumed by the same hunger that was now claiming Jim. Bill's explosives were set. He held the detonator in his shaking hands, looking between Jim and the chamber entrance. "I'm sorry, buddy," he said, "but I can't let this spread." Jim smiled, and for a moment, he looked like himself again. "It's too late, Bill. It's already spreading. Every mine, every tunnel, every hole we've ever dug, they're all connected, and now it can travel through all of them." He was right. I could feel it, a presence moving through the earth itself, following the network of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the mountain. It was ancient beyond measure, patient beyond understanding, and hungry beyond imagination. Bill triggered the explosives. The chamber filled with smoke and debris, but through the chaos, I could still hear Jim laughing. The sound followed us as we ran through the tunnels, past the elevator shaft, up to the surface where the morning sun felt like a blessing. When the dust settled, the chamber was gone. Tons of rock had collapsed, sealing the entrance forever. But I knew it was too late. The object was gone, and Jim was gone, and something else was now loose in the world. The company closed the mine permanently, citing safety concerns. The official report blamed the cave-in on structural instability. The 3 missing miners were declared dead, their bodies never recovered. Jim was listed as another casualty of the collapse. But I know better. I know that Jim walked out of that mine carrying something that should have stayed buried. I know that whatever was in that crystalline object is now free, moving through the underground networks that connect every mine in the region. And I know that it's still hungry.